Professor Lungisile Ntsebeza. Lungisile Ntsebeza is a professor and holder of the A.C. Jordan Chair in African Studies at this university. He's also the holder of the National Research Foundation Research Chair in Land Reform and Democracy in South Africa. He has conducted extensive published research on the land question in South Africa around themes such as land rights, democratisation, rural local government, traditional authorities, and land and agrarian movements. His book, Democracy Compromised, Chiefs and Politics of Land in South Africa, was published by Brill Academic Publishers in Leiden in 2005 and also by the HRC Press in 2006. He has also co-edited two books, The Land Question in South Africa, The Challenge of Transformation and Redistribution, and Rural Resistance in South Africa at the Polar Revolt after 50 years. His current research interests, apart from land and agrarian questions, include an investigation of African studies at the University of Cape Town and a related project on the political and intellectual history of the late Archie Mafeji. Please welcome Professor Ntsebeza.
Or in your pocket is fine.
Yeah.
Just clip it.
Does it work?
Yeah, you can test.
Okay. Hello? Can you hear me? Okay. Good evening, and thanks to the organizers of the summer school for inviting. Hello? Can you hear me? Okay. Oh yeah, that's fair. Thanks to the organizers of the summer school for inviting me. When we planned these lectures, it was around about September last year, and something or things have happened over the last 2 to 3 weeks, and we've had talks about expropriation without compensation being now a fundamental policy of the ANC and so on. So I would imagine that people would be interested in discussing some of those issues. Unfortunately, they are not covered in this lecture series. But the good thing is that on the third lecture, which would have been on Thursday, is going to be presented by Meshia Andrews, who unfortunately cannot make it. So we have space there. And as a Democrat, I thought, I could talk to you and find out what you want us to do with that third lecture. Could be an issue that you're interested in. I can virtually talk about everything about the land question in South Africa. And so this is something for you to consider. But we had also planned to utilize that third lecture differently. Today's talk is about chiefs and people living in the rural areas that are controlled by chiefs. I thought I could give today an overview of the issues and the dynamics in the former bantustans, in the rural areas of the bantustans. And then tomorrow, my colleague, Dr. Fanny Nkapai, not Nkapai, I see, they say it's Nkapai, it's NCA, and NCA is pronounced Nkapai. He's sitting over there. He can talk about a court case in the Eastern Cape that was decided by the High Court in Bishop. And this court case is a very pertinent case for the issues I'm going to raise here today, in the sense that some villagers contested the interpretation of one of the laws that were promulgated in 2003, Traditional Leadership and Governance Framework Act, which was interpreted by the Eastern Cape government to mean that the royal family, whoever that is, has the authority to appoint a headman without consulting the people. That case went to the High Court in Bisho, and the residents won the case. The Eastern Cape government appealed the lower court decision, and the case went to a full bench of 3 judges, and the residents won even at that level. So the decision of the lower court was endorsed by the higher court. Fanny worked very closely with the people who brought this case to court. So he can talk about that tomorrow. And then on Wednesday, he'll talk about his own research. Thursday is Wednesday. I say on Thursday, which will be the 3rd lecture. So what you see as the 2nd lecture here could be the 3rd lecture, where Fanny will talk on the topic that he had prepared for this. And then on the 4th day, I can talk about social movements and so on. So it's really up to you. If you can give me an indication before we leave here, whether you want to tell us what we should talk about on the 3rd day, or you want us to follow our program. It's all up to you. Okay.
Just a question. I take it, looking at the program, we're talking mainly about rural and farming type land.
Rural?
You know, land, if you take all these different meanings of fixed property, covers all sorts of things other than farming. Are you focusing mainly on the farming side?
I'm focusing on politics of land, which is a governance issue, which is what I'm going to talk about today. And tomorrow we are going to talk about land use, if you follow this program. Mesha was going to talk about land use, especially the campaign that is underway in the Western Cape on food sovereignty, but unfortunately she's not here. And then I go back.
Land use, do you cover all the various things that land occupies?
I'm not sure what the various other things are, but land use, to put it simple, is about people's access to land and what they do with that land when they gain access to it.
And that would include things like shopping centres, blocks of flats?
It could include everything. It could include everything, including housing. In fact, that's a good starting point. And something that I was going to say, in beginning of this series, that when I talk about land, I don't talk about land as agriculture, and I don't see land as a rural issue solely. It is certainly about rural, and it is certainly about agriculture. But that's not the only interpretation or the only meaning I attach to land. There are land issues that confront us in urban areas. We call those housing often, but they are land issues. But then there's an issue that is hardly discussed and under-researched, and that's the issue of urban farming, where people in urban areas, some from rural areas, try to make a living out of land, either by using land for agricultural purposes or by keeping stock. And I'm sure most of you see cattle and goats and sheep whenever you drive from the airport. So there is that dimension of land. But today I'm going to talk about land, the politics of land, as it pertains to what I call the countryside or the rural areas. And my starting point, departure point there, is that colonialism divided the countryside in South Africa into two. You have your commercial farms, large-scale commercial farms that you see all over the place if you drive around South Africa and so on. But then there's also the countryside that is in the former bantustans and whose governance is under the control of traditional authorities. Some people use the term traditional authorities, some use the term chief, and I use the term traditional authorities, some use the term traditional leaders. And this is what I want to talk about today. But it is not the only issue that focuses on land. The issue that I want to raise here is the role of chiefs in a constitutional democracy. And this question arises out of a particular context. And this context is that of chiefs who, during the colonial and apartheid periods, collaborated with those governments. They implemented policies that rural residents hated a lot. Policies that at the height of rural resistance led to what is known as the Polar Revolt. And I'm sure most of you would know about that. One of the books that is mentioned here that I co-edited is a book on those revolts when we're commemorating 50 years of the Polar Revolts. So by virtue of their collaboration with the colonial and apartheid governments, chiefs were by and large detested and hated. This was the case until the dying days of the apartheid system in the late 1980s and early 90s. Surprisingly, at least I find it surprising, certainly, chiefs have, despite their role as outlined above, not only survived up to the post-1994 democratic era in South Africa, they have won unprecedented powers in rural areas. And the question is, how has this happened? In fact, just to remark about the current period. Last week, almost on a daily basis, we saw the president of the ANC and the deputy president of the country visiting chiefs in KwaZulu-Natal, in the Eastern Cape, and so on, and making statements about the important role that chiefs can play in a democracy. But 30 years ago, if you talked about the same chiefs, some are still alive, they were playing a different role. So the puzzle that I'm working with in my work, and I've been doing this for the last 25 years, is how this has happened. Now, part of the explanation is that the African National Congress, the ANC, emerged as the only party that could challenge the National Party rule. As a liberation organization, the ANC was urban-based and biased. They were very thin on the ground in the countryside, both on commercial farms and in the former bantustans. Their strategy for the countryside was to work with chiefs with the hope that progressive, what they called progressive, in some cases comrade chiefs, would embrace the ANC policies of democratizing rural areas, Whilst the ANC, and this is important, would offer them, the chiefs, a non-political ceremonial role in a democratic South Africa. In other words, much of the argument, the ANC argument, rested in part on the presumption of good chiefs who resisted apartheid and eschewed involvement in local government during the apartheid era. There is a tradition of chiefs who worked with the liberation movements, but the numbers were few and far between. In the late 1980s, a group of chiefs organized themselves under the Congress of Traditional Leaders of South Africa, Controlesa, and immediately aligned themselves with the ANC. However, there was another group, a group that was organized under the banner of what was then called Inkatha Cultural Organization, now called Inkatha Freedom Party. And this group was vehemently against the ANC. They were initially against the UDF when the ANC was banned, and when the ANC was unbanned, they declared war, literally war, against the ANC. I happened to be a lecturer at the time at the University of Natal, it was then called UND, University of Natal, Durban, and I witnessed some of the violence that was taking place in that part of the world in the late 1980s, early 90s. So the ANC was negotiating with two groups of chiefs.
Could you say more about, beyond the IFP opposing the ANC, what was the nature of their opposition?
The nature of the Inkatha opposition.
Yeah, why did they oppose the ANC so strongly?
Well, I suppose it was a tough situation where the IFP felt that the ANC was threatening their political authority, especially in KwaZulu-Natal. You will remember that in the 70s, 80s in particular, Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi was regarded as the spokesman of South Africa. I remember reading statements from Margaret Thatcher and so on, where they all were almost idolizing Buthelezi, especially if you compared Buthelezi with Matanzima and Sebe, people who were seen as downright puppets of the apartheid regime. So it was partly that. I think it was mainly a political issue and a struggle for control of territory. So the ANC had these two groups of chiefs that it had to contend with. One working closely with the ANC, but the other one working with against the ANC. So the basis for the ceremonial role of chiefs was directed more towards the chiefs who were under Controlesa. Now, this basis that no chiefs would be given a non-political ceremonial role in a democratic South Africa was shattered by the rejection of this role, not only by the IFP, but by Controlesa. If you remember, those of you who were following the news, in 1995, there was a big march that was organized by chiefs, where Chief Patekile Holomisa and Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi were sort of hugging each other, leading this protest. They were opposed to the transfer that is, the two groups now coming to the working together, they were opposed to the transfer of land to democratically constituted structures, which is what the ANC was now proposing at the time, that governance, land administration, everything should be sort of democratized. But the two groups sort of came together and argued that land administration should be transferred to tribal authorities. You remember what tribal authorities were. Tribal authorities were a form of local government in the rural areas of the former bantustans. They were made up of a majority of appointed chiefs and a few elected sort of representatives. But on the whole, tribal authorities were unrepresentative. Now, in the end, the ANC-led government opted, despite internal differences and the dubious history of traditional leaders, particularly during the apartheid era, for the coexistence of democratically elected leadership at national, provincial, and local government levels. And at the same time, the institution of traditional leadership was recognized, and they were assigned the task of local administration, including the all-powerful role of allocating land. So this compromise, call it, if you want to call it, this compromise, in fact, didn't alter the apartheid order in terms of who was in charge in the rural areas. This led me to put forward an argument, and this was the basis of my thesis, my book, and most of the publications that came out of this kind of. It led me to put forward an argument that questioned the recognition of the institution of traditional leadership. And my reasoning was that in a constitutional democracy where elected representation is the order of the day, especially in South Africa, where the majority of people were subjected to kinds of governments where they didn't have a voice, you would expect that this notion of elected leaders would be extended to all South Africans. At one level, this was extended at national, local government, provincial level. But at the local level, as I said, chiefs who are unelected, who are unrepresentative, who are unaccountable, were made to rule people at that level, at the village level. So I saw this as a fundamental contradiction in the South African Constitution. Now, I went further, of course, arguing with people who were saying that chiefs or traditional leaders are by their nature democratic, that the traditional structure of indigenous people is by its nature democratic in the sense that people debate and discuss issues and so on. Suppose, a notion of that is partly informed by Mandela in his book, Long Walk to Freedom, where he talks about this democratic nature of chieftainship, where people debate things endlessly for days, if need be. But what we often forget is what Mandela says at the end. But says at the end, the chief takes the decision, and the decision that the chief takes is not questioned. So, arguing against that, and against people who were saying that the chiefs were popular and so on, I argued using a case study that, if we agree on our plan, Ngapai is going to talk about yesterday, of people who opposed chiefs because of their collaboration with the apartheid regime. So in a way, I was arguing against those people who were saying that chiefs are democratic. And my argument is that if they are democratic, they should allow people to make the decision as to whether they are democratic or so. It could be an election as we know it today, but there could be other forms. But the bottom line is that the people must decide, and we must have a measure that will demonstrate to all of us that chiefs are popular and that they are a popular choice. That is not happening anyway. So this is one part of my research. The other part of the research is influenced by the court decision that I talked about. Remember, my argument is that the Constitution contains a contradiction. Talks about elected representation. At the same time, it recognizes an institution that is not, whose incumbents are made up of people who are not elected and so on. The interesting thing about this case, I don't want to talk about the case because Fanny is going to talk about it. The interesting thing about this case is that the higher court decision resolved what I thought was a contradiction. The higher court read the Constitution very closely, and their interpretation of Chapter 12 that recognizes the Constitution, they brought something that I always ignored, almost was dismissive of, that the institution of traditional leadership is recognized subject to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So that was the departure point of Plaskett, who read the judgment that was endorsed by others. And having made that point, used that as a departure point, he went through the Constitution and highlighted sections in the Constitution that showed what the Constitution, our Constitution, stands for. And all the sections that he highlighted make the same point, that whether it was customary law or whatever, that whatever custom or customary law dictated had to conform with the Constitution. And the Constitution, especially the fundamental rights, is for democracy. In fact, Plaskett went so far as to saying that the case in the Eastern Cape should be used by chiefs as a model as to how they can democratize their structures, which in many instances would mean that chiefs would be elected. So we are now faced with a position where at the level of law, we have a decision by a full bench of a province, the Eastern Cape, that says that there's only one way for chiefs to exist, and that is to subject themselves to democratic practices and so on. But when we look at what is happening, including what we saw in the last couple of days, chiefs are still, the favor of our government. They were the favor of the Mandela government, the Mbeki government, the Zuma government, and now seems the Ramaphosa leadership. So where does that put us? It puts us in a position where I will argue on Thursday or Friday when you look at social movements, where I say that if the government is not prepared to follow court decisions, court judgments and so on, the only way one can change things is through pressure from below. And this is where social movements become important. I was asked to talk for about 30 minutes, and my 30 minutes is over, and I would like to field questions.
Very interested in your analysis. I found it very fascinating. One of the things I can't understand is why we don't look at other societies that have been through the same sort of thing. One society that I've studied fairly carefully started off with 1,000 chiefs. At that particular stage, its GDP was 8% dependent upon domestic service. What they then did was buy off the chiefs and make the land saleable. They said, right, if you've got a tribal right, you can sell it. And you can sell it to your neighbour so he can enlarge his farm if he needs to. Or he can sell it and use the money to move to town. And that happened. Within 40 years, it moved from 80% rural to 70% urban, with no slums in the town because the people came with money with them. Do you know what that country was? Because you've been studying this land question, and that's a simple example of a country called Germany. That's what it did. It bought off the chiefs. It set up a land bank and said, chiefs, we will buy the land from you. Now here's a big wad of money. Take it and live off the fat of the land for the rest of your life. And just like that, Bismarck cured the problem of Germany. In that 40 years, we went from 8% domestic service to 8% of banking. So that was the contribution of GDP. It was a huge revolution, and nobody seems to study that sort of thing. The same sort of things happened recently in Peru, where by making the tribal land fungible, you read the writings of Hernando de Soto, for instance, you'll find that's exactly what has happened there.
Yes.
You can do it. You've got to have the will to do it.
Who's we? I'm tempted to ask. Because, yes. The various issues that come out of your contribution. First, is about comparing sort of countries. And I'm not sure whether Germany is the best example that one can use to compare our case. I would be happier if we were to quote a country on our continent where conditions are similar. And if you were to do that, or if you were to ask me, I would say that most of what you're suggesting has been tried on the continent, and it hasn't worked. On the issue of land as dead capital, people have used, in Tanzania, they have used De Soto. The author De Soto, who talks about exactly the issue of making land a commodity and so on. But what are we seeing in Tanzania? We're seeing landlessness. We're seeing people in urban areas. We're seeing people in urban areas that are incapable of absorbing those people as labor. Might have happened in Germany, but I like theory. I look at theory, but I also want to test theory. That theory that we come up with, which might have worked well in Germany, has been tried on our continent, and it hasn't worked. And I don't see it working in South Africa. I don't see it working in South Africa, and also because in South Africa people don't have land. Remember that 13% of land was supposed to be given to blacks. That's in law. In practice, in 1994, less than 13% of the land was available to the majority of South Africans. We have a dismal land reform program which has failed, and no one disputes that. So what land are they going to sell? So well, I mean, the issue of land not being sort of the property of the chiefs is a debatable issue. Some argue that it's a colonial invention, that in the past, land was deemed to be a national asset. It belonged to the group. And that is why if you go to the rural areas and you ask people about their lallies and villages and so on, often it's either in the name of the chief, but often in the name of the dominant tribe in that area. And that's testimony that, before the introduction of private property and so on, pre-colonialism, people didn't see land as a commodity that could be bought and sold. They saw land as the air that we breathe. There's a hand at the back. Right, yes? Mm-hmm. Well, the problem is that the chiefs gain their authority, their power, by virtue of the fact that they are supported by the state. So when people protest against the chief, who intervenes? It's the state. So this is the point I was trying to make here, that there is no evidence that I've come across of a chief who is in power because of popular support. Popular support. In many instances, in the places that I've done research in, chiefs exist because they are protected by the state. They were protected by the colonial state, they were protected by the apartheid state, they were protected by the current state, our democratic state. Okay, that's fine. Da.
Traditional leadership structures in some other African countries, and I would say mainly, they were undemocratic because of their exclusion or marginalization of women. Do you think that's true in South Africa?
That was true, but the question is, is in a way, sort of the role of women. Yeah, and oppression against women, marginalization of women, and so on. And I say that, if you look at this, you have to look at this, historically. In the past, land was allocated to the head of the family, and the head of the family was the man. Decisions were taken by men, who in many instances worked in urban areas. And women stayed in the villages. They tilled the land. They looked after livestock and so on. But the decision to sell this ox or that ox was taken by the man, was not involved in it. But I think the picture is changing now. It is changing in the sense that, in many villages, once again, I can talk about places that, I know where I do research. There is a growing number, or the growing number of households that are controlled by women. And in the research world, we call those women-headed households. And in some instances, especially after the late 80s, early 90s, when democracy went to the countryside through the involvement of chiefs, where they occupied land, redistributed land, and so on, chiefs are now forced to allocate land to women and to women in their own right. I don't say that no, this is happening across. What I'm saying is that no, there are areas where this is the case. And there may be areas no, where chiefs believe no, in places like Kamata, where Matanzima stronghold and so on. Those old practices, no funny, and I tell you about that. The old practice of women not being in governance, women not owning land, and so on. Those practices no, still happen. But of course, I mean, if sort of, and this is where social movements can be important. We know that no, this is unconstitutional. What is lacking is a mechanism or a way of using the Constitution to the benefit of ordinary people. If you're looking at the state, things may not happen.
Can you comment on to what extent the threat of violence has maintained the status quo? And if I can put my question in context, I live close to a chieftainship in KwaZulu-Natal. And the chief there, before 1994, was an established warlord. Civil disturbances there. He doesn't have a democratic vote in his body. He has maintained that attitude successfully, entrenching his power. And he's not alone. Can you comment to what degree that threat has? Indeed, Mangosuthu Buthelezi, before the 1994 elections, posed the threat. If you do not secure the rights of traditional leaders, you will face a revolution. Saying that before 1994.
Yeah.
To what extent has that shaped the last 23 years?
I think, I mean, there's a danger no, of generalizing. You know, seeing one case, when a case in KwaZulu-Natal and think that is happening across the country. I haven't done detailed, in-depth research in KwaZulu-Natal. But no, I work with people who do research no, in those areas. And what no, they'll tell me, and what I've seen no, in the years now I was working at the University of Natal, is that no, there are areas, or there were areas in KwaZulu-Natal where everybody knew were dangerous zones. And you wouldn't no, set foot there if you cared about your life. But there are also areas in KwaZulu-Natal where it was thoroughly safe to go to. I worked for an educational development program at the time. I used to recruit students from deep rural areas in KwaZulu-Natal. I speak isiZulu, but with my Xhosa accent and so on, so they immediately recognize, you know, the minute I open my mouth that I'm Xhosa and so on, but no one heard me. But I knew that there were places that I wouldn't go to. So, but in the Eastern Cape, once again, no, you know, the power of chiefs. In some areas, no, chiefs are powerful. And chiefs know who are supported by the state, who are supported by private capital, especially in those areas where there's mining and so on. Those are dangerous chiefs. In Pondoland, the Amadiba Crisis Committee will tell you that they lost their leader, Pazuga, 2 years ago through violence. And that's what's in Pondoland. But you go to the Krisani district municipality, it's a different ball game. Most of the chiefs that I know there enjoy their bottle of brandy. Let's...
Thank you so much for that. I just want to, I'm getting a sense that you're saying during the transition, when the transition happened, the ANC sort of caved in because of its social base and it being maybe located in the urban area, sort of caved in to what you call maybe the balance of forces at that time, and caved into the demands of the traditional leaders or authorities at the time, the demands of the chiefs at that time. And now you're talking about the ANC and the symbolic visits to the grave of the chiefs and talking about the chiefs and all those things. The question I'm asking now presenting with the EFF's stance on the jail or the sentencing and conviction of Dalinge and the statements they made about Roman jurisprudence. And so, I mean, you spoke about social movements and the pressure from below, but I'm just wondering, in terms of political parties, is this perspective that the chiefs, or the way through the hearts of the people in the countryside is through the chiefs, is this an entrenched perspective, and is there any way that we can maneuver that space?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good question, especially, I mean, this thing about the EFF and so on. I mean, politics is politics. I suppose people will tell you that, your vote and the vote of your enemy is the same. It's a question of numbers and so on. But, there is this widely held notion, which is not backed up by research, that says that if you gain the support of a chief, you get the support of the subjects. That's a view that is widely held. Now, I say, there are people who arguing, and politicians in particular, they argue that if you win over the chief, then you have won over the constituency of the chief. But research tells us something else. Olomisa, for example, Pategile Olomisa, Chief Pategile Olomisa, in his area, he's an ANC chief, but his area is controlled by the UDR. So if the ANC sort of wooed him because they thought that they would get the votes of those people, it's not happening like that. I mean, this is just a case that it might be sort of an exception, but what I'm trying to say is that there is no empirical evidence that backs up that statement. But it is a view that is held by a number of people. But there are people who are even prepared to go further to say that, look, let me not take a risk. Let's get chiefs on our side if that's possible, rather than push them to the opposition. But that's a tactic that politicians use. I'm not a politician of that type that garners for votes.
You mentioned on a couple of occasions that the chiefs have the power to allocate land. If a person's allocated land, what sort of rights does it give them? Whose land is it that gets allocated?
Yeah. Well, the chief sort of gets the right to allocate land because the law prescribes that the land will be redistributed, allocated by the chief. And what rights do you have? Some people apply for a piece of land to put up shelter, their house, and a kraal and a small garden. Some apply for a field where they can cultivate and so on. The right to grazing is a right that you automatically gain as a resident. You don't apply for that.
I hear what you're saying, but what is the legal basis of that allocation?
The legal basis of the allocation is that at the end of the day, you are given what used to be called the permit to occupy. And the permit to occupy gives you occupation rights of occupation. And there are conditions as long as my arm, one of which is that you cannot sell that land. This is one of the reasons, in fact, when you talk about production and so on, land use, you asked that question earlier, then you talk about financing your projects and so on. And about financing, you talk about collateral and so on. That kind of piece of paper is not recognized by banks. So you cannot put your land, though it's not that, you cannot put your land with that title as collateral when you want funding. But then there are other forms of titles. There is the quid rent, which is an old system, British colonial system, which is still there. that sort of form of landholding gives you more rights, better rights than the permit to occupy. But it is inferior when you compare it to a title hold. I mean a title deed. A title deed which gives you exclusive rights, which also gives you the right not to sell your land without consulting anyone if you want to sell the land. It's yours. And of course there's leasehold, which is very common in many parts of the African continent these days, to make it possible for mining companies and people who want to establish businesses in rural areas to use the land for security. Because if the lease is 99 years or 50 years and so on, it's as good as a title deed. Okay, let's go right at the back. I see 2 years here. I'm not sure whether they follow you. I mean, when you say upholding the integrity of traditions and so on, can you explain that a bit?
I speak in a sense, touching on what you said about the way in which the chieftaincy is structured to govern. I've come to find that even in judiciary, it's a similar approach or similar way in which things are. And to look at the social aspect, and just speaking generally, when you speak to someone who's a hardcore tradition, they understand all of these principles in a traditional context or traditional nature. But when you speak to them about a judicial nature or a different sort of system, people tend to create an uneducated society in a way, because you are teaching people a certain system or philosophy that is alien to their customs and their practices. So I talk about such integrity. I speak about the integrity of tradition, because it goes with customs as well as the philosophies of religion and so on and so forth. So how do you respect such philosophies and integrity whilst also democratizing it at the same time?
No, my understanding is that what is now called living customary law has become part of our legal system. I'm not a lawyer, but this is what I read. So custom, tradition, all of those now are recognized. But there's always that subject. That's subject to the Constitution. If, say, a traditionalist beats up a child or whatever, then that's against the prescriptions of the Constitution. So that tradition will will be discouraged. So I don't think that there are two legal systems that are at war with each other. And that's my understanding of, that's my reading of the judgment that Fanny will talk about if we discuss now this case, that the custom that prevailed in that area was recognized and was seen to be conforming to the Constitution, to the Bill of Rights. And just one thing, I mean, you haven't raised this. I mean, there's a question of tradition, custom, and there's a question of traditional authority. I have my own customs and traditions, but I don't come from a traditional authority family. So I always would like to emphasize the distinction between customs which affect maybe all of us, and traditional authority. Traditional authority is a device that in our debates is associated with colonialism, with indirect rule, with the importance of dividing a majority in order to rule them. Who's okay?
The permit to occupy, is that assigned to an individual or a family? So if an individual dies, does the individual's family, can they anticipate that they would maintain that permission to occupy, or could that land be allocated to somebody completely different or a different family?
Yeah. Well, in practice, if land is allocated to you, you keep it. You keep it. And communities know that it is so-and-so's land. But problems now arise when the state or the chief wants that land. Then now you don't have the title that you can go to court and say, no, look, defend me against this.
But if he dies?
If he dies, no, your son takes over. No. If I die, my children will take over.
Including your daughter. Boy or girl?
Well, these days, no, I suppose. I mean, boys and girls, no. But in the past, it was men, the eldest in the family.
Whether it's boy
But
or girl?
no, men. It was male.
No, women.
The eldest son.
The oldest son.
But if you have
But-
sons.
Well, no, the uncle. You'll have an uncle or a brother or something. But I mean, no, it's no. I want to repeat this. It's important, to read, to understand these things in an historical context. Things change. Things change, and this issue of women and so. I mean, I'm surprised by the land that is owned by women in the villages that I go to. You go to this, tell you, no, it's no let, no by, it's a woman. It's a woman. People don't marry. That's the other thing. For whatever reasons. They don't marry, but then they have children, and they need shelter. And they get shelter. Shelter, no. Yeah.
I was interested because, I mean, the upper house of the South African Parliament is the traditional chief. It's called the Council
Of Provinces. Yeah.
If it's just got members of what you've been talking about, tribal chiefs, I mean, aren't there an incredible... How does the democracy work if you have a lower elected house and you have an upper house of traditional leaders who are very conservative? I mean, how does it operate?
Well, in law, I mean, the way I understand it, in law, their powers are, they can recommend.
They can only recommend.
They can recommend, yeah. Yeah. But of course, they have a muscle.
No, but is that the house of traditional leaders?
Yeah.
Distinguished from
The House of
National Council
of Provinces, yeah.
Oh, it's two separate.
Yes, it's separate. No, thanks, yeah. Yeah. There are provincial houses of traditional leaders, national house of traditional leaders, and then the house of...
Yes, Professor, thank you. Of course, the most famous colonial colony was Hong Kong, where nobody owns the land. I mean, the state owns the land, all of it. Now, those people there are amongst the richest in the world without owning the land. In the tribal areas, when you get allocated land, do you get a diagram? Do you know how long you can stay there? Is there a rent passing?
Mm-hmm. Well, no, you do get sort of a diagram, and your land gets registered, but the land is not surveyed.
It's not what?
Surveyed. Surveyed. Yeah. Yeah, surveyed.
Okay. Why not?
Well, the land is owned by the state. I mean, there are reasons for this.
You can still have pigs.
Pigs.
You know where you are.
Oh yes, no, they know their boundaries.
Oh, yeah.
They know their boundaries. But you don't have a piece of paper that says that no, it's registered in the deeds office. That no, this and that and that. No, it's not that system. The traditional council and the relevant department at a provincial level. No, the land is legally owned by the state. It's administered by the chief. That's the current situation. It's administered by the chief, but it's owned by the state. And people have occupation rights.
Surely the whole issue is the title deed. Because if there is a title deed, then a parent who has, say, 2 children, one of whom is a real baddie and one of whom is a real goodie, never mind the gender, can say, well, this one deserves to inherit, or this one is really interested in developing the land, and this one's got another agenda. The parents, do they have any right to leaving a will for their children?
Yes. They can leave a will. I mean,
And will anybody take any notice of it?
you see, for me, I mean, the significance of a title deed, when I look at, life in rural areas, is that with a title deed, you can sell your land. You sell. You can go to the bank and say that, no, look, I have this land, this is the value of the land, give me money, and so on. In terms of land security, tenure security, I know of families who have lived in there for ages. And when you ask them, and I do ask people because my research is historical, I go back to the 19th century, they say that, no, so-and-so, their great-great-father lived there and so on. And no one is worried about this. They say, no, the threat happens when the state wants that land. They just take it and you don't have recourse to courts. So there's a question of tenure security. Some people say that there's no production in rural areas because there's lack of security of tenure. I haven't found any evidence to back that up. If people are unable to produce, it is because they don't have the power using their certificates of occupation to raise funds through banks. And that's not a tenure security issue.
Just a question which may come into another lecture, but it pops up every now and then when there's an election coming, is a prohibition of foreign ownership of land in Australia. Now there's some countries like Australia which are really against foreign ownership. Others like the Brits don't give a damn, they let anyone buy. And we seem to be somewhere more towards the British side where anybody can just come in and buy what they want from now.
So, that's the case now, except that we threaten to sort of take away that right. But
some politician every now and then says we've got to bring in a law to stop it and then nothing happens.
Well, that's the problem with policy. Okay. Oh yeah, I've covered that. Okay, thanks.